Right now, you are never more than a few steps from daylight. Flip a switch, open a door, walk outside. Light is a given. You barely think about it. You've probably never spent more than a few seconds in total, complete darkness in your entire life. But somewhere in the deep past, a group of humans took a torch, got down on their hands and knees, and crawled into total darkness. Not for minutes, for hours. Into passages so narrow their shoulders scraped both walls at once. Down drops so steep that one wrong step meant they never came back up. Past the point where sound behaves differently, where the air goes still, where your own heartbeat becomes the loudest thing in the world. And the strange part is this: they weren't lost. They weren't fleeing a predator. They were choosing to go down. Sometimes hundreds of feet. Sometimes what would translate to nearly 2,000 feet of total underground distance past the last flicker of sunlight into a place the human body was never built to survive in for long. Why would anyone do that? The real answer is far stranger than shelter. Because the deepest, darkest chambers of ancient caves were rarely where people actually lived. They were something else entirely. And what ancient humans built down there? Far from daylight, far from safety, far from any obvious survival benefit, is still rewriting what scientists thought they understood about the minds of some of the earliest members of the human family. Start with the obvious question: why go underground at all? For most of human history, caves solved a problem your body still remembers even if you don't consciously think about it. You are a mostly hairless animal with no claws, no armor, and skin that burns, freezes, and bleeds easily. Compared to almost every other large mammal you'd have encountered on the ancient landscape, you were slow, soft, and poorly equipped for a direct fight. A cave mouth gave early humans something a flat, open landscape never could: a wall to put your back against, a roof that couldn't be torn away by wind or flooded by a sudden storm, a single entrance to defend instead of 360 degrees of exposure to whatever might be hunting in the dark. Most cave use across human history happened right there, near the entrance. Within the first 20 or 30 feet, where daylight still reached, where smoke from a fire could escape upward instead of choking the people below, where you could still hear something approaching from outside before it arrived. Archaeologists find hearths there, butchered animal bones, stone tools, sleeping areas worn smooth by repeated use over generations. It's practical. It's exactly what you'd expect from any animal seeking shelter. But then, in certain caves, scattered across different continents and different eras, the evidence trail doesn't stop at the entrance. It keeps going, past the light, past the point where a fire smoke could safely escape, into total disorienting darkness. And that's where things stop making obvious sense. Take Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France. In the 1990s, spelunkers pushed roughly 330 meters into the cave, more than 1,000 feet from daylight, through passages so tight in places that a person had to drop onto their stomach and pull themselves forward with their forearms. And in a large chamber deep inside, far past where any natural light could ever reach, they found something that shouldn't have been there at all. Broken stalagmites, hundreds of them, deliberately snapped off near their bases and arranged into two large ring-shaped structures, along with smaller stacked piles nearby, some of them showing clear traces of fire that had burned directly on the stone. For years, nobody could confidently date the structures. Stalagmites form so slowly that dating them accurately requires specialized techniques. Then, in 2016, a research team led by archaeologist Jacques Jaubert used uranium series dating on the thin mineral crusts that had grown naturally over the broken stone after it was placed. The result, published in the journal Nature, put the structures at roughly 176,000 years old. Read that number again. Not modern humans. Not even close. That date places the builders firmly in the era of Neanderthals, tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens are believed to have reached that part of Europe at all. Think about what that actually means. A group of Neanderthals, working by firelight in a chamber where no daylight had ever touched, deliberately broke hundreds of stone formations down to a similar length, then arranged them into a structure with clear intention, not scattered by accident, not randomly piled, circular, repeated, deliberate. Why go that deep, through that much difficulty, to do it? It wasn't for warmth. Deep cave chambers hold a strange, stable temperature year-round, usually sitting somewhere in the 50s Fahrenheit. No matter the season outside, cold enough that lingering there without a real reason makes little practical sense. It wasn't for defense either. No predator on the surface world was ever going to follow a group of Neanderthals 1,000 feet into a black, twisting, narrowing maze of stone. And it almost certainly wasn't daily living. There's no dense layer of everyday debris in that chamber, no long-term hearth buildup from years of cooking, no worn pathways carved by repeated daily use the way you'd expect from an actual home. Which leaves a much stranger possibility. That deep cave chambers, at least for some ancient humans, weren't about survival in the practical sense at all. They may have been about something closer to ritual, memory, gathering, or meaning, something that required going somewhere hard, somewhere separate from ordinary life, specifically because it was hard and separate. Now push forward in time and across a continent, to a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star. In 2013, recreational cavers exploring the system found a narrow vertical chute, barely wide enough for a single human body, dropping down into a chamber now known as the Naledi chamber. To reach it today, researchers have to squeeze through a passage nicknamed Superman's Crawl, where you can only fit through by lying flat with one arm stretched out ahead of you. Further in lies a vertical chute so narrow in places that only slim, small-framed individuals can physically pass through it at all. Paleoanthropologist Lee Berger had to recruit an entire team of exceptionally slender scientists, since he and most of his senior, more experienced colleagues physically couldn't fit through the passage themselves. The team became known, half-jokingly, as the underground astronauts, because reaching that chamber required nearly the same combination of physical risk, isolation, and specialized skill as a space mission, except the destination was straight down into the Earth instead of up into orbit. Inside that chamber, hundreds of feet underground, past sections requiring you to turn your head sideways just to keep moving forward, past drops where a single misplaced hand or foot could trap you permanently, they found bones. Not a few scattered fragments. Over 1,500 fossil pieces, representing at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown human relative, later named Homo Naledi. Here's the detail that unsettled the entire field of paleoanthropology. Homo naledi had a brain roughly a third the size of yours. By most older assumptions about intelligence, cognition, and behavior, a brain that small simply shouldn't have been capable of complex, deliberate, symbolic behavior. And yet the bodies in that chamber weren't washed in by flooding. They weren't dragged in piece by predators, the way you'd expect from scavenging. They weren't scattered the way a chaotic accident, like people stumbling into a pit and dying one after another over generations, would typically leave remains. Berger and his team, publishing extensively through the 2010s and continuing research since, argued the evidence increasingly points toward deliberate body disposal. In other words, something uncomfortably close to intentional burial carried out by a species with a brain a third the size of a modern human's, in a chamber so difficult to reach that transporting a body down there would have required real physical effort, real risk to the living, and Firelight the entire way in and the entire way back out. Why go through that much trouble, that much danger? For the dead? That question sits at the center of ongoing scientific debate, and it hasn't been fully settled. Some researchers remain cautious, pointing out that natural geological processes can occasionally mimic patterns that look intentional to the untrained eye. But the pattern found at Rising Star, repeated across a physically brutal, remote, and permanently lightless chamber, has pushed many scientists to seriously reconsider a core assumption that had stood for decades. That symbolic behavior, ritual, an early sense of meaning attached to death itself, might not require the large brain long assumed necessary to produce it. Notice what both of these sites share. Despite being separated by continents, tens of thousands of years, and possibly an entirely different species of ancient human, Brunicle and Rising Star aren't remarkable simply because ancient humans occasionally went underground. Plenty of animals do that for shelter, warmth, or safety from predators. They're remarkable because ancient humans went far past where survival required them to go, into total, disorienting darkness, and did something there that looks far less like hiding and far more like meaning-making. There's a third thread worth pulling on here, and it has to do with light itself and with what people were willing to risk in order to be seen and to see. Deep cave art, the kind found far past any natural daylight in caves like Lascaux and Chauvet in southern France, required an enormous, deliberate investment just to be created and viewed at all. Someone had to carry fire deep underground. Someone had to keep that fire burning steadily for however long the work took, sometimes hours at a stretch. Someone had to navigate back out afterward, through the same disorienting blackness, using nothing but memory, instinct, and a torch that was slowly, steadily burning down to nothing. Researchers studying pigment residue and soot deposits in these deep chambers have found clear evidence of animal fat lamps, torches crafted from resinous wood, and even what appear to be scaffolding marks used to reach higher sections of cave wall that would otherwise have been out of arm's reach. None of that effort was necessary for basic survival. All of it was necessary purely to make something meant to be seen, deep in a place built entirely out of dark. There's a fourth site worth mentioning here, one that adds a different kind of clue to the pattern. Denisova Cave, tucked into the Altai Mountains of Siberia, isn't especially deep by the standards of Brunikehl or Rising Star. But it held onto something just as strange. Layers of sediment stretching back over 100,000 years preserve traces of at least 3 different kinds of ancient humans who used the site at different points in time. Neanderthals, a little understood group now called Denisovans, known almost entirely from fragments of bone and traces of ancient DNA, and eventually, modern humans. In 2018, researchers led by Viviane Slan analyzed a single small bone fragment from the cave and discovered something remarkable. It belonged to a girl who was the direct offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. 2 different, distinct populations of ancient humans, meeting, mixing, and raising a child, all traced back to fragments recovered from that one cave system. Denisova Cave wasn't chosen for its depth. It was chosen, it seems, for something closer to its position. A kind of crossroads, sheltered and defensible, where different groups of ancient humans could return to again and again across tens of thousands of years. It's a reminder that caves weren't just physical shelters. They were, in a sense, meeting points, places carried forward in memory and passed down, generation after generation, as somewhere worth returning to. Put these 4 sites together, and a pattern starts to take shape that goes beyond any single discovery. Cave use wasn't one behavior. It was a whole spectrum of behavior. At one end, the ordinary, practical use of a cave entrance for shelter from wind, rain, and predators, the kind of use you'd expect from almost any species seeking safety. At the other end, something far stranger. Trips taken specifically into the deepest, hardest, most dangerous parts of a cave system, for reasons that have nothing to do with weather or safety at all. And that spectrum raises a bigger question about the ancient human mind itself. For a long time, one of the working assumptions in the study of human evolution was that symbolic thinking, the ability to attach meaning to an object, a place, or an act beyond its immediate practical use, was a relatively late development, something that arrived alongside modern humans, alongside bigger brains, alongside more complex tools and language. But Brunikehl pushes that assumption back by well over 100,000 years and attaches it to Neanderthals rather than modern humans. Rising Star pushes it further still, suggesting a species with a much smaller brain may have engaged in behavior that looks like deliberate, repeated ritual around death. Taken together, these sites have forced many researchers to loosen their grip on the idea that symbolic behavior required a large, modern brain to begin with. Something about going into the deep dark, it seems, may be a far older, far more deeply rooted human behavior than anyone expected. There's also a simpler, more physical explanation worth sitting with, one that doesn't require assuming religion or ritual in the way you might think of it today. Complete darkness does something measurable to the human mind. Researchers who study extended time in deep caves and other lightless environments have documented altered perception of time, shifts in mood, and in some cases mildly altered states of consciousness after long enough exposure to total sensory deprivation. Without daylight to anchor a sense of day and night, without visual landmarks to orient yourself, the brain starts relying on other signals entirely. Some researchers have speculated that ancient humans may have understood, even without any formal science behind it, that the deep cave altered how a person felt and thought, that it was, in a very literal sense, a different state of mind, reached by going somewhere different in the world. If that's even partly true, it reframes the whole question once more. The deep chamber wasn't just symbolically separate from ordinary life. It may have been experientially separate too. A place that didn't just represent something different from the surface world. A place that actually made you feel something different once you were standing inside it, torch in hand, breath echoing off stone that had never once seen daylight. So here's the reframe. Ancient humans didn't crawl nearly 2,000 feet into the earth because the surface world had failed them. They went down because something about that darkness, that silence, that total separation from the ordinary, Daylight world mattered to them in a way that's hard to fully reconstruct from bones and broken stone alone. The deep cave was a place set apart, a place where the everyday rules of hunting, eating, and sleeping stopped applying, and something else, something closer to ceremony, took over. That's a strange thing to sit with, because it means the deep cave wasn't really a shelter at all, not in the way the entrance chambers were. It was closer to a chosen space, deliberately hard to reach, deliberately separate from ordinary life, which, if you think about it carefully, is a description that still applies to plenty of places humans build and seek out today. You still do this, in your own way, more often than you might realize. You still seek out spaces deliberately set apart from ordinary life. A quiet room set aside specifically for prayer or reflection. A dim theater where the lights go down on purpose before a story even begins. A concert where the crowd deliberately plunges itself into near darkness and noise, cutting itself off from the ordinary rhythm of the day outside. Psychologists who study ritual behavior, including work summarized by researcher Dimitris Xygalatas, have noted that difficulty and effort are frequently part of the point, not an unfortunate obstacle to be minimized. A space that's hard to reach, or a ritual that costs something real to complete, tends to feel more meaningful to the people involved than one that costs nothing at all. Xygalatas has studied this pattern directly in extreme rituals around the world, from firewalking ceremonies to genuinely painful pilgrimage rites performed in remote, difficult-to-reach locations, and found that the physical cost of participation is consistently tied to how strongly people bond with their group afterward and how much meaning they personally attach to the act they've just completed. The harder it is to get there, in other words, the more it tends to matter once you arrive. That's not so different from 1,000 feet of crawling by torchlight through a passage barely wide enough for your shoulders toward a chamber with no practical reason to exist. Your ancestors, or at least some of them, seem to have understood something you still act on instinctively, even now. Even with electric light in every room of your home, that meaning often needs distance from the ordinary in order to feel real. That some things are better carried out somewhere the daylight simply can't reach, somewhere getting there costs you something real. Something physical, something that can't be faked or shortcut. Which brings the question back around, fully reframed from where it started. It was never really about how ancient humans survived nearly 2,000 feet down in total darkness. Survival, in the practical sense, never actually required them to go that deep in the first place. The real question, the one the bones and the broken stone and the soot on ancient cave walls keep quietly pointing toward, is why humans, then and now, keep choosing to go somewhere hard to reach, somewhere deliberately set apart from the world of daylight and daily routine, whenever something needs to feel like it truly matters. Tonight, you'll walk into a room and the light will come on the instant you touch a switch. You won't think twice about it. It will feel unremarkable, automatic, barely worth noticing. But somewhere in your instincts, in the part of you that still seeks out quiet, that still seeks out spaces set apart from the noise of ordinary life, a much older habit is still quietly running in the background. One your ancestors carried nearly 2,000 feet underground, by flickering firelight, on their hands and knees, into the total dark, entirely on purpose.